very broad scope in what we're taking in as part of our programme. And last night we talked about bees, and tonight we are going to hear about the eels of Faversham. And absolutely delighted to have as our speaker tonight Matthew Hatchwell. You may have seen his name associated with the emerging neighbourhood plan, because he's been doing a huge amount of work for us all on that account. But his credentials, I've got in front of me his part of a sort of a short version of his biography, absolutely astonishing range of work from in various parts of Africa, helping to establish national parks in the Congo, and working to help various teams in different places, wildlife, partly to do with the Wildlife Conservation Society, where he was Director of International Policy and Programme Development, and then later the Zoological Society of London, where again, as a sort of a Director of Conservation, he's responsible for driving conservation, field conservation programmes in more than 50 countries worldwide, working with governments and non-governmental organisations and local communities to protect lots of different species and habitats. And at the moment, he's a consultant and chair of the advisory board of the Durrell Institute for Conservation and Ecology at the University of Kent. So he has got fantastic credentials. But as far as I'm concerned, the great thing is that he took an interest in the fate of the amazing eels that are part of the life cycle and story of our creek. And so I am absolutely delighted to hand the platform over to him to explain what he's been doing to give our eels a helping hand. Matthew, thank you. No, I can't hear anything.
No, I'm not. Okay, great. Thanks very much for the introduction, Griselda, and thanks everybody for giving up your Tuesday night for eels. So just picking up on Griselda's introduction, the last couple of years since I left Zoological Society of London have been absolutely wonderful, because I've been able to get back into a position where I can actually get involved with conservation on the ground. And so what I'm going to tell you about eels in the next half hour or so is basically the story of how I've spent at least part of my time over the last couple of years trying to help eels locally here around Faversham, but also taking into consideration the problems facing eels globally. So first little fact, they're the only species that occurs here in Faversham that is globally endangered. And so that's, given my background in wildlife conservation, that was one of the reasons why eels were an appealing species to work on in the first instance. Shirley, I'm unable to move on to the next slide for some reason. Here we go. Okay. So before I talk about any other aspects of eels and their conservation, it's important to go quickly through their ecology, because it's quite complicated. And so understanding the pressures on eels really depends on a basic understanding of their ecology. So they're unusual among fish in that the adults breed in the Sargasso Sea in salt water. The eggs hatch and the larvae basically float back to Europe on the Gulf Stream. And that's the leptocephalus up at the top of this slide. And by the time they arrive in European waters, they've metamorphosed into small glass eels, which are around about 8–10 centimeters long. And so when we go out looking for eels arriving from the Sargasso Sea here, it's glass eels that we see. And what they're trying to do is make their way from the saltwater ecosystems into the freshwater streams and rivers and lakes of Europe, where they metamorphose first into pigmented elvers, then after a few years into yellow eels, and finally again into the full adult silver eel. And that can take 15, 20, sometimes 30 years. And then the silver eel, which, there are some pretty large individuals in Stonebridge Pond, for example, that they then need to be able to get back out again from the freshwater stream, back out into the sea, and then they swim all the way back to the Sargasso Sea and breed and die. So they breed once in their lives, and that they have to be very successful breeders, because obviously only a tiny proportion of the hatchlings will make it all the way back to reproduce. And so even though there are still millions of glass eels that arrive in Europe every year, the ecology of the eel requires that they breed in vast numbers in order to simply survive as a species. So if any of that was unclear, we can come back to that later. But building on this question of their ecology, the real issue with European eels is that the number of glass eels arriving in Europe every year has fallen by somewhere between 95 and 98% since the 1970s, 1980s. So the number of those small glass eels arriving here is a tiny fraction of what it used to be. And therefore, it's much harder to count the adult eels that are making their way back to the Sargasso Sea, but there's no doubt that it's a small fraction of the numbers that you used to be making it. And there are a number of reasons why those numbers have fallen so dramatically. Nobody can say for sure which of these factors, which of these threats is the biggest. But certainly through the 1990s into the early 2000s, overfishing, especially by French fishermen on the mouth of the Loire, was a massive factor. They were collecting hundreds of tons of glass eels every year, which represented billions of elvers. And even though there were so many of them, the species simply couldn't take that type of harvesting on that scale. There's also a suspicion that climate change is changing the speed and the direction of the Gulf Stream, and that would have a dramatic impact on the ability of the leptocephaly, the larvae of the European eel, to make it back to Europe from the Sargasso Sea. The third threat is from the illegal wildlife trade. Even people who've been doing wildlife conservation for decades, so many of my old colleagues didn't know that the most trafficked species in the world is the European eel. And I didn't put the number up on the slide here, but the value of the illegal trade in European eels is thought to be something like £2.25 billion a year, which is more than for any other species in the world. A fourth pressure comes from pollution. That may be current pollution. I'm sure everybody's read about pollution of British freshwater streams and rivers from poultry farms and agriculture. There's also the impacts of historic pollution with heavy metals, and that might be a factor in Faversham Creek, we don't know. In some places where water is pumped from estuaries and rivers to cool power stations and coastal factories, where there aren't sufficient screens, then eels can be pumped in with the water and obviously get all churned up in fans and pumps and things. And in some places that's a big pressure. And then finally, for the UK as a whole, the largest threat is thought to be the obstacles that are put in place to control on the Thames estuary to control flooding. So the sluices and weirs that have been in place in some cases for hundreds of years actually constitute substantial barriers to the movements of elvers and adult eels. And that's what I'm really going to focus on for the rest of my talk, because for the UK as a whole, the Environment Agency reckons that about 75% of the pressure on eels comes from those barriers. I can't remember what the number is for Kent. I think around 500 barriers in Kent alone. And for the UK as a whole, somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 barriers nationwide. So when the little glass eels, which again are maybe 8-10 centimeters long by the time they're swimming up Faversham Creek, but by the time they get to the head of the creek, they've come maybe 4,000 miles, and they've just got a little bit further to go to make it into Stonebridge Pond and maybe up into the Westbrook. But by the time they've made it up past the purifier building and under Flood Lane, they're then confronted with these vertical sluices, which are their final barrier before they can make it up into the freshwater ecosystems. And there are similar barriers all down the creek at the head of Orr Creek, and all over Kent. And the easiest way to enable them to get past are these bristle boards, which are just drop down in the water, and they provide the elvers with just enough purchase that they can then wriggle up and over into the freshwater ecosystem. And so the way I started getting involved with eels was basically looking at this issue at the two sluices that are still functioning in Faversham allotment. So this is at the head of the creek. You can see, I don't know if you can see my cursor on your screens, but the purifier building next to Morrison's is down here in the bottom right, and yeah, the allotments all are over here, and Davington Hill coming up to Dark Hill. Dark Hill is kind of over here, I guess. This is the Duck Pond, Stonebridge Pond, and the Westbrook comes up round here to the knoll. So there are two sluices that are active. There's a third one which is blocked over here, and basically one of the things I've been trying to do for eels over the last year or so is try to adapt the barriers here to make them more passable for the incoming glass eels. And this is one of them. This is sluice 1 there at the top. And it basically consists of this vertical sluice on the left-hand side where the yellow drawing is. And then the water goes down under that penstock sluice at the back and up into Stonebridge Pond beyond. And what we've needed to do is design a bristle board that just kind of slots over the top of that front sluice like this. And this is the bristle board that we put in place in March, just in time for the Elva run this year. And it's an easy short story to tell now, but it basically took a year to get all the necessary permissions from the Environment Agency, from Swale Borough Council, who are responsible for the watercourse, and then not least to actually design the bristle board. I don't know if you noticed on the specifications on the previous slide, we were originally thinking that all of the bristles would be outward facing, but the latest thinking is that at least the one that sits over the top like this has to be downward facing. So we had a big debate among eel specialists what was going to be the best configuration, and this is what we ended up with actually on both of the sluices at the allotments. The allotments are relatively straightforward in that it's just this vertical sluice. In other places, it's rather more complicated. So this is the sluice at the tidal flap at the outlet from the White Drain, which is the watercourse that drains the marshes out at Sea Salter. And the reason I put this slide in here is that there's this very large secondary flap in the middle of the larger tidal flap, and you can see that there's water flowing. This is low tide. There's no pressure of the incoming tide on that gate, and so the water is flowing out from the bottom there. The problem with a flap like this is that as the tide comes in, it's designed to close, and so the water backs up on the far side, which means that nothing can get through in either direction. And because elvers and glass eels tend to move on the spring tides, they would find it very hard to get through unless there was this adaptation, which is called a cat flap. And this flap is designed to stay open for about half an hour on a rising tide, which enables the incoming glass eels and elvers to get through. And for the adult silver eels, which are trying to migrate in the opposite direction, to get out. But as we'll see later on, it sounds relatively simple, but it isn't, because if they're not properly installed, these things don't work. And unfortunately, we have an instance of that right on our doorsteps here in Faversham. I don't know if anybody recognizes this. This is the tidal flap, cast iron tidal flap at the head of Orr Creek. So that's Orr Road, just beyond the wall there, and you've got the castle and the Three Mariners off to the right. So conventional thinking is that an unadapted tidal flap like this is basically impassable to eels and elvers, but in fact that's not the case. I don't know if anybody is familiar with the other end of this culvert where it goes under the road at Orr Road. If you ever get a chance, the meadow on the other side of the road there is owned by Kent Wildlife Trust. And there's a beautiful little arched bridge that crosses the stream that flows down from the gunpowder works to the head of the creek there. And if you go there on a high spring tide, ideally at night, around Easter, on the rising tide, you will see glass eels that are able to get past the tidal flat there before the tide gets too high, and they then swim through the culvert up into the bottom of that meadow. And if you're familiar with the water levels there, the pond in the country park is a good 8 or 10 feet higher. And the way that the elvers make it through there is that they actually leave the flowing water and they wriggle their way through the wet field and up into the country park there. So they're incredibly tough, incredibly resilient. They don't need to stay in water, but they do need a bit of a helping hand where we can provide it, which, as I say, is what we've been trying to do here in Faversham. So this is an instance of where things have gone a little bit wrong. So I'd be curious to know how much it cost the Environment Agency to update the sluice, the outlet here at Thorn Creek. But this is the one just past the sewage works on Faversham Creek. And they very carefully installed 2 beautiful new tidal flaps, complete with cat flaps. So theoretically, they're state of the art. But unfortunately, they were installed in such a way that the cat flaps are permanently underwater. So they don't work. And we haven't tested the site yet to see whether any elvers at all, any glass eels are getting through. But what we do know for sure is that the cat flaps aren't working. So we haven't started talking to the Environment Agency yet about what can be done to adapt them again so that they work properly. But this is an instance of how not to do it, unfortunately. So now that we've taken care of those 2 sluices at the head of Faversham Creek, we've started looking again with the Environment Agency and other partners, including the Medway and Swale Estuary Partnership, MSEP, at other sluices within the 2 boroughs that basically need the same treatment. And this is an incomplete map of the other sluices that we need to look at. But actually, if you look at this map carefully, you'll see that even that one at the head of Orr Creek there, which isn't exactly discrete, it's right there under a public highway, is not marked. And so the first thing we're going to have to do is go around and complete this survey so that we're sure that we're looking at all of the sluices. And then we're going to hopefully systematically talk to the landowners of all of those sluices and see what can be done to upgrade, improve the passability of all of those barriers across the 2 boroughs. The photograph here is of 2 bristle boards that are installed on the sluice. Again, I don't know how many of you know it. This is at the Ore Marshes, which is managed by Kent Wildlife Trust. The outer sluice has got a beautiful cat flap on it, no problem there. But on the inside, there are these bristle boards which were designed and installed several years ago, when I assume there was water coming over the top of that sluice. Now there's none. So those bristle boards are completely useless because the water levels are wrong. And so in this case, it's an example of how you need to look at secondary structures as well, not just the principal ones, and potentially adapt those as well as the principal structures. So that's what we're going to be trying to do across Swale and Medway once we've been able to raise the money to do it. That's the cat flap on the Ore Marshes barrier there. So these are the various steps that we're going to go through with that broader program. As I say, the first step is to raise the money to do that. We reckon we need somewhere in the range of 20 to 30,000 pounds to adapt all of those barriers. Just to give you an idea, those bristle boards that we put on the two sluices in at the allotments in Faversham basically cost us nothing. They were bristle boards that the Environment Agency had sitting around in a workshop in Canterbury. At one point, we'd been told that we needed to go and work with independent contractors who would design and install the eel passes for us. And the quote that we got for that was £7,000 for each of those sluices. So if one goes that commercial route, the cost is potentially enormous. One reason why one might want to do that in the future is that there's a disadvantage with the bristle boards, which is that it's very difficult to count the incoming elvers and get an idea of how effective they are in improving the passability of the barriers. And so a lot of people have asked me, since we installed those bristle boards at the allotments, whether it's increased the number of glass eels getting through. And the truth is that we don't know. We hope so, and we'll find out in future by monitoring the number of adult eels in Stonebridge Pond, whether there are more of them. But right now, it's very hard to know. So one of the things we want to do with this broader program is develop methods of monitoring glass eels, so that we've got an idea of what the relative importance is of Stonebridge Pond, for example, versus the gunpowder works, versus Ore Marshes, the Kent Wildlife Trust Reserve, and what the relative importance is compared to the number of elvers arriving in the Severn Estuary, for example, or in Northern Ireland, which is a Loch Ness, which is a very important site for eel fisheries. So the method, just very briefly, the existing method of monitoring glass eels is really quite complicated, and you need to spend probably thousands of pounds for each site, putting in complicated steel channels which are designed individually for the different sluices where they're installed. And there's a much cheaper, more cheerful way of doing that, which is called mop head monitoring. And so you just take basically, it's a like an old-fashioned mop, and you put a weight on it, you drop it into the water, and the incoming glass eels will make their home temporarily in the mop head, and you can just take the mop head out of the water, put it into a white bucket and shake it out, and then just count the number of glass eels that you've got in there, and it'll give you an idea of how important one site is compared to others. And so that's the kind of thing that we're looking at doing throughout this area in future. So I'm going to wind up in a second. If anybody wants to know more about eels, there's more and more being written about them, actually. This was the Christmas issue of The Economist last year. So very, very good article on eels. A longer version of the talk that I've just given was published. It was the cover article in British Wildlife magazine last month. First time they've ever run an article on European eels. And Faversham Life published a piece on eels last year. There are also various books on eels. A very recent one that I know Gulliver's familiar with, the Gospel of the Eel, which was published just a few months ago. And there are others. Tom Fort, the Book of the Eel. There's lots more information out there. But I'm going to close up there, and would be very happy to answer any questions or respond to any comments that anybody might have.
Wow, thank you so much, Matthew. That's an amazing summary of a very complicated and fascinating subject. I don't know if anyone has any questions, please do use the chat opportunity to put your questions in. I've got two questions myself. One is, do you need voluntary help with any of this? It seems to me, you've got a lot of distance to cover, and is that something that's of use to you? And secondly, eels are commercially very significant, the restaurant trade and so on, and I wonder if you see that as a risk or a potential opportunity.
Thanks, Griselda. Those are both great questions. One of the reasons why I've been really keen from the outset to incorporate monitoring in what we do, certainly in Faversham and more broadly, is precisely because of the opportunity it gives for volunteers. So the Zoological Society of London, where I was for 2 years, actually has an eel monitoring program, and I was very keen that we would feed into that with monitoring that we do here in Faversham. Unfortunately, the sluices at the allotments are not suitable for the type of eel pass that one would be able to monitor. So it hasn't been possible so far, but hopefully once we've cracked the design and use of these mop heads, we absolutely will need volunteers to monitor them. And actually, even this last Easter, the first time I went out looking for glass eels on a spring tide was on very early on the morning of Easter Sunday last year, so 2019. And last year that was fine. We had no lockdown. This year it was in the midst of the first lockdown. And so rather than teaming up with anybody else, I went out with my youngest son, and it all felt a little surreptitious. And we went out to Orr and watched the glass eels at 2 o'clock in the morning, wriggling their way through the culvert there. And hopefully by the time we get to next Easter, we won't have to be so covert about it. And we can mobilize maybe half a dozen teams who can do the same thing in several locations. So as for your question about the commercial side of this, well, it's a little bit complicated. On the face of it, a species that is critically endangered, isn't a good one to go out and eat. At the same time, about 95% of the eels that are sold commercially for consumption in Europe are farmed eels. So they're not caught in the wild, or at least the adults aren't. The problem with eel farming is that nobody has yet figured out how to allow adult eels to reproduce in captivity. And so even eel farms depend on glass eels caught in the wild, basically for their operation. And so even if you do buy a smoked eel here in Faversham, what's the name of the fishmonger doing it? Herman's.
Yeah.
Herman's have smoked eel, but those elvers, the elvers, the glass eels that those smoked eels came from, would have been wild eels that came all the way from the Sargasso Sea. So there are still millions of glass eels arriving in Europe every year, but personally, given the choice, I wouldn't be eating them.
Thank you.
So I think that's the bottom line.
Amanda Thesiger has asked who's carrying out this valuable work, and I don't know if you've already answered that in a way. Is it just a very small group of people?
Well, so the Zoological Society of London has got two of the world's experts on European eels working for them, and they're certainly leading on eel conservation in the southeast, and on the Thames. But there are lots of other organizations also doing good work. There's something called the Sustainable Eel Group, which provides a degree of coordination around eel conservation. But again, that's a little bit complicated because the Sustainable Eel Group, as you can kind of tell from the title, works quite closely with the eel farmers. And so there's a bit of an agenda there, and the Sustainable Eel Group actually would quite like to some of the bans on trading eels. They're quite keen for those to be lifted, and I think overall that would be premature.
Okay, there's quite a few other questions here. How do birds, this is from the Ingrams, Tim and Gillian Ingram, how do the birds in Stonebridge Pond affect eel numbers?
Well, they probably do. There are, I've never actually seen this, but I know one person at least who has seen herons out on Orr marshes catching and swallowing adult eels.
Wow.
And I'm sure that the ducks and the swans on Stonebridge Pond would be doing the same thing. And actually adult eels, so that they're not only carnivorous, but also cannibalistic. So the adult eels will eat baby eels, or the glass eels.
Okay, thank you. There's another question here. How long do bristle boards last? That's from my husband, actually, that question.
Yeah, Andrew, a very good question. So the ones that those very thin ones that are on the sluice out at Orr marshes, I suspect have been there for certainly 10, 15 years. We were very concerned that the ones that we put in at the allotments might not even last the year, because they're a little bit more complicated, because there are 3 of them essentially bolted together. So because that was experimental, if we make 2 seasons with those, I think we'll be fairly pleased. Once they're installed, our ambition is to go back and check them every year to make sure that they're still in place. So we'll be able to answer that question more accurately in future.
Okay, another question from Angela Richmond Fuller. Once this pandemic is over, will there be any in-person events to explore these eel sites more? A moonlit walk to observe those eels wriggling towards the pond would be amazing. And she also says, in Canada, we use electronic fish counters for monitoring numbers in streams. Do you use them here in the UK for eels?
Yeah, so those we've looked at the feasibility of those electronic fish counters, and the Environment Agency does use them on some watercourses, but they're very expensive to install. And so the glory of these mop heads is that they'll cost a few pounds each, whereas the electronic fish counters cost a few £1,000s each.
Right.
So and then there are other potential solutions in between. The moonlit, I love the sound of the moonlit walk. I must say that, over the last 3-4 years of wildlife conservation, I haven't seen anything much more dramatic than the little glass eels trying to get through the sluices at the allotments, and being picked off by the adult eels that were lurking at the bottom of the sluice. It's really dramatic stuff, frankly. And the first year, last year, when I was there watching, the high tide, the high spring tide on Easter morning was about 6 centimeters short of the top of the sluice. And so what the glass eels were doing were they were coming up to the surface of the water, and then they were leaving the water and wriggling up the last 5 or 6 centimeters through the moss and over the lip into Stonebridge Pond. And you could just kind of hear a David Attenborough type voice kind of giving the commentary and the dramatic music to go with this effort to make it those last few inches, from the Sargasso Sea. It's really dramatic stuff. And so, yeah, I hopefully this coming Easter, if not, then the next one, I would love to take people out and see that in person. It's very exciting.
Fantastic. Gulliver asks, what is being done to reduce eel trafficking?
Not enough is the answer to that. So someone was actually prosecuted for smuggling glass eels from the UK to China in suitcases via Heathrow earlier this year. So the eels that he was caught with were worth an estimated £53 million. And he got off with a suspended sentence. So not enough is being done.
That is really shocking.
Yeah.
Angela has another question. Do any eels come up the Stour or the Stour? I don't know quite what's the best pronunciation, really.
So I can't say for sure, because as far as I know, no one has actually done the monitoring along the Stour, but almost certainly they do, because eels basically are present in pretty much every freshwater ecosystem in the country, or they would be if they were able to get past the barriers that we put in place to control flooding, and just to manage our waterways. So theoretically, yes, they do.
Fantastic. Well, Angela says perhaps a moonlit walk would be a good way to raise money for conservation work. And she also says we'll keep our eye out when we're along the Stour. So that's amazing. I don't know if there's any more questions that people have.
Well, should I just add, and it's actually very difficult to see adult eels in the daytime, but at night, if anybody is walking past Stonebridge Pond at night with a powerful torch, shine it on the water, and there's a fairly good chance that you'll see eels in there. So I've seen them down at the allotments at night several times.
Fantastic. Someone says, oh, it's Angela again, where do the eels hang out? Are they along the bottom or at the sides? Where are they likely to be in the water?
Yes, at the bottom. So in Stonebridge Pond, in those leats through the allotments, they'll hide in the silt in the bottom of the pond.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, there don't seem to be any more questions at the moment, and we're coming up to nearly, well, we've got to sort of 50 minutes really now. So I would like to say thank you very much indeed for an extraordinary presentation, Matthew, really interesting and inspiring. So thank you very, very much. I hope in due course this recording will be available for people who weren't able to see it tonight. But we've had a very good attendance this evening, so thank you to everybody for coming along. And we hope to see you again tomorrow, where we're going to have another presentation. We've got eels tonight. Tomorrow will be David Carey's virtual guided tree walk along the Westbrook. So that's it. Thank you very much, everybody. And good night. Thank you. Wonderful.
And thank you, Griselda, for organising this.
Well, you're very, very welcome.
Everyone for listening. Thank you.
So fruitful. Thank you very, very much. And thanks to Shirley for all the technical backup that she's given us all. Thank you. Lots of thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye then, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.